I don't believe men were created to be pawns in someone else's game. I believe we were created to be steward kings, men under authority, yes, but entrusted with real responsibility. Not perfect men, but disciplined ones, men who rule themselves, serve God directly, and refuse to live in fear. This is king, not pawn. Look, I don't think it's crazy to say that anger is one of the most misunderstood emotions in modern culture. Some people think that anger is always wrong, and others think anger is some proof of strength, but I think scripture treats anger differently than both of those views. Anger itself is not necessarily the sin, but uncontrolled anger is, because when anger becomes your master, you stop ruling yourself. And a man who cannot rule his emotions cannot lead anything else. Anger, it's a it's a signal, not a king. We need to make this distinction. Anger is often a signal that something is wrong. Whether that's injustice, betrayal, disrespect, corruption. Jesus himself, he did actually express anger, okay, because he overturned tables, in the temple when worship was being exploited with the animal sacrifices and all the money changers and everything like that. But here's the difference: Jesus controlled his anger. Many men today are so controlled by their anger, and those two are completely different things. And I'm sure you've probably seen this before. A conversation becomes tense, and maybe somebody challenges you. Maybe there's some form of disrespect involved too, and immediately the emotional temperature rises. Voices get louder, words get sharper. The goal shifts from solving the issue to just winning the moment. But once anger takes over, wisdom leaves the room and the damage follows. Anger ultimately, it makes you easy to control. One of the dangers of uncontrolled anger is how predictable it makes you, because if someone knows that they can provoke you, then they also know that they can manipulate you. All they have to do is push the right button. Your reaction becomes automatic. But a man who cannot be provoked easily, well, he's difficult to manipulate, now isn't he? That kind of emotional stability is real strength. And scripture, just as it showed how Jesus had anger, it also warns against uncontrolled anger. James writes, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. This is James 1:19 through 20. So notice that phrase. Human anger, it does not produce righteousness, meaning that anger by itself rarely solves the problem. More often, just multiplies it. So let's look at how anger and pride actually correlate, because uncontrolled anger is often connected to some form of pride. When a man's ego is fragile, every challenge that he faces feels like an attack. Every disagreement feels like a form of disrespect. And anytime he has to be corrected, it feels like some kind of humiliation. And that's where, you know, pride enters the picture, because pride feels threatened and anger rises quickly because of it. But secure men, they don't react that way. They can hear criticism without collapsing. They can face disagreement without exploding on the other person, because their identity is not built on being right all the time. So think about this for a second. Just imagine for one moment that somebody insults you publicly. And I'm talking like somebody hits something that just hits home in a way that only hits home to you. Okay, the instinct you're going to have, right, is just immediate retaliation, to embarrass them back, to dominate the conversation. But instead, you decide to pause. You breathe, you respond calmly. That moment of restraint, it reveals something deeply powerful. And that's that you are no longer ruled by your emotions. You are ruling yourself. And that kind of self command earns self respect. Who'd have thought? Rage, it destroys relationships. One of the most damaging consequences of uncontrolled anger is relational damage. A man who explodes frequently, he creates this instability around him. Friends become cautious, family becomes defensive, children become anxious, because they never know when the next outburst is going to be. And leadership cannot grow in an environment that's just full of that emotional volatility. People need stability to thrive. Now let's talk about anger and masculinity for a second, because some men, they think that anger just proves they're masculine, but that's often just insecurity disguised as strength. Anyone can lose control. Anyone can yell. We've all done it. Anyone can threaten. I'm sure we've all done that online too. But do we say it in the real world? Some probably do, and that's a whole other thing. But it takes discipline to remain calm under pressure, because masculinity is not emotional chaos, it's emotional mastery. So, the reason why I think this is such an issue is because we live in a culture that profits from your outrage. There's this other thing that we really need to talk about with the culture, because outrage is often profitable. News cycles, they thrive on it. Social media thrives on it. Algorithms, they'll push content specifically to provoke your anger, because angry people stay engaged longer. You ever wonder why you're seeing all the political stuff on Facebook, Instagram, X, and why you're either, you're constantly reading the comments or then you're replying? That's all very purposeful. That's what they're wanting you to do, because the systems around you are constantly trying to provoke your emotional reactions. Because if you react to everything, you become predictable. But if you remain steady, you become difficult to control. So, speaking of online, let's just kind of make an example of that real quick. You could see a post online that irritates you. You immediately begin typing. You're ready to dismantle the argument that's presented in front of you, but then you pause, you ask yourself, is this really going to build anything meaningful? Sometimes the strongest response is restraint, silence, not because you lack conviction or anything like that, but simply just because you choose not to waste your energy on chaos. So, speaking of, let's go ahead and make a breakdown now between righteous anger and fleshly rage, let's call it. Because there is a difference between righteous anger and the rage of the flesh. See, righteous anger, it seeks justice. Fleshly rage, well, it seeks domination, okay? Righteous anger, it remains controlled, versus a fleshly rage, it is very much more just explosive in nature. Righteous anger, it protects the vulnerable. Fleshly rage, well, it just protects your ego alone. The difference lies in self-control. I know I had a video on that a little while back, and maybe if you'd like, you can go back and watch it. But for now, let's go ahead and talk about anger and leadership. A leader who cannot control anger, he becomes dangerous, right? I think we've all seen this on the national scale, because decisions made in rage are very rarely wise. They're just reactive. They're short-sighted. They're emotionally driven. Strong leaders, and I know I'd, probably get some heat for this, so I'm not going to necessarily say it right now in this specific video. But I think we can all think of different strong national leaders just globally if we're paying attention. And those leaders are the ones who are slow to anger. Not because they're passive, but because they understand the weight of their influence. And that's why it's important when talking about leadership is to discuss the discipline of calmness. Because calmness is not personality, it's discipline. It means, learning to breathe before reacting, to listen to somebody before choosing to speak, pausing before responding. Those small little disciplines change the trajectory of the conflict. A man, he can resolve situations that, an angry man would destroy, a calm man, that is. Anger, it often hides pain. Ultimately, like these people that are explosive with their anger, there's some hurt going on there. Sometimes the anger is not the real issue. It's covering up something deeper. Hurt, insecurity, fear, maybe some shame. Anger feels powerful. Pain, it feels vulnerable. So some men out there, they hide pain behind their rage. But, maturity requires honesty about what's underneath the reaction. So ultimately, guys, anger is powerful. I'm not going to debate that. But power without control becomes destruction. A steward king, he does not eliminate anger, he simply governs it and he uses it when it's necessary, but he never lets it rule over him. So I tell you, master your emotions. Don't let outrage dictate your behavior, because the man who cannot control his anger, he will eventually destroy what he was meant to build. And the man who can remain calm in chaos, well, that's the kind of man that becomes someone others trust to lead.